The flames that consumed Mary Ann Cobb's diner didn't just burn wood and grease. They ignited the fury of the most feared motorcycle club on Earth. When corrupt local cops looked the other way, 500 Hell's Angels descended on a quiet mountain town, and the streets practically shook with vengeance. The smell of gasoline and charred hickory hung heavy over the damp morning air in Pine Ridge, Oregon. At 68 years old, Mary Ann Cobb sat on the tailgate of her rusted 1994 Ford F-150, a thermal blanket wrapped around her trembling shoulders, watching 35 years of her life smolder in a pile of blackened timber. The copper skillet was gone. It hadn't been just a roadside diner. To Mary Ann, it was the living memory of her late husband, Arthur, who had built the counter by hand out of reclaimed oak. It was the place where local loggers, passing truckers, and weary travelers could get a bottomless cup of black coffee and a slice of cherry pie that tasted like home. But to Mayor Clayton Briggs, it was an eyesore standing squarely in the path of a multi-million-dollar land acquisition. Pine Ridge was dying, bleeding out from the closure of the local lumber mill. But Briggs had struck a backroom deal with a commercial developer from Seattle. They were going to build a massive, corporate-owned truck stop and casino just off the new highway bypass. There was only one problem. The prime access point for the development required leveling the copper skillet. Mary Ann had politely refused their first offer of $80,000, a fraction of what the land was worth. She refused their second offer of $100,000. That was when the polite negotiations ended and the intimidation began. It started small. The town's health inspector, a jittery man on the mayor's payroll, suddenly found code violations in Mary Ann's spotless kitchen, slapping her with heavy fines. A week later, a heavy rock shattered the diner's front window in the dead of night. When Mary Ann called the police, Sheriff Harlan Dodd, a man whose morality was as flexible as a wet reed, shrugged it off as the work of bored teenagers. He didn't even bother to take down a report, but Mary Ann was stubborn. She patched the window with plywood, paid the fines from her dwindling savings, and kept flipping pancakes. She didn't realize the lengths Clayton Briggs would go to clear her off the map until 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. She had been jolted awake by the violent barking of her golden retriever, Buster. Living in a small trailer just 100 yards behind the diner, Mary Ann looked out her window and saw the sky glowing an unnatural, violent orange. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, the roof had already caved in. Mary Ann had stood in the freezing rain, her heart fracturing in her chest, as she watched the neon sign, the copper skillet, open 24 hours, melt and crash into the inferno. As the dawn broke and the embers hissed, Sheriff Dodd's cruiser crunched onto the gravel lot. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He kicked at a piece of scorched siding, hitched his duty belt, and looked down at Mary Ann. "Tragic thing, Mary Ann," Dodd said, his voice completely devoid of empathy. "Old wiring in these buildings. Bound to spark up eventually." "It wasn't wiring, Harlan," Mary Ann said, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "I smelled the gasoline from my porch. Someone torched my diner." Dodd's eyes narrowed. "Now don't go throwing accusations around. My fire investigator, Mayor Briggs's brother-in-law, as you know, already took a look. Said it started near the deep fryer. Grease fire. Open and shut." "You're lying," she whispered. The fight draining out of her. "The insurance company is going to get my report by noon," Dodd continued, ignoring her. "Given the state of your finances, they might even look into whether you lit the match yourself for the payout. If I were you, Mary Ann, I'd take that buyout the mayor offered, pack up your trailer, and move to a town with better luck." Dodd tipped his hat, climbed back into his cruiser, and drove away, leaving a widow alone in the ashes of her life. The twisting of the knife came 2 days later. The insurance company denied her claim entirely, citing Sheriff Dodd's official report of criminal negligence regarding the deep fryers. The developer, through Mayor Briggs, issued a final insulting offer: $25,000 for the scorched lot. If she didn't take it, they would use eminent domain to seize the property for public utility, leaving her with absolutely nothing. Marianne was beaten. She had no money for a lawyer, no family left to lean on, and a town government entirely aligned against her. She spent Thursday afternoon digging through the blackened ruins of her office, searching for anything salvageable. Underneath a collapsed beam, buried in wet, grey ash, she found Arthur's old fireproof steel lockbox. She pried it open with a crowbar. Inside, smelling faintly of smoke, were her marriage certificate, Arthur's silver pocket watch, and a small, leather-bound address book. And tucked inside the front cover of that book was a single, soot-stained business card. It was black, featuring a stark red and white insignia, a winged death's head. On the back, written in thick black marker, was a single phone number and a name: Dutch. Marianne stared at the card, her thumb tracing the embossed wings. The memories flooded back, bridging a gap of nearly 15 years, and for the first time since the fire, a hard, cold resolve settled into her chest. The year was 1994. It had been a torrential downpour, the kind of rain that turned the winding mountain passes into slick, treacherous death traps. Marianne and Arthur were just closing up the copper skillet when the door flew open. A massive man clad in soaked, heavy leather staggered inside, his face pale, clutching a deeply gashed and bleeding leg. It was William Dutch Vanderhorn, the president of the Oakland chapter of the Hells Angels. He had hit a patch of loose gravel on the ridge, throwing his custom Harley-Davidson into a ditch and tearing his thigh open on a piece of rusted guardrail. Most townspeople would have bolted the door and called the police. Marianne Cobb grabbed her first aid kit. For the next 3 days, while the storm raged, Dutch laid low in the spare room of their trailer. Marianne stitched his leg herself, changing the dressings every 4 hours to stave off infection. She fed him homemade stew, kept him hydrated, and, most importantly, Arthur drove his pickup out in the dead of night, winched Dutch's damaged bike out of the mud, and hid it in their barn under a tarp before the highway patrol could spot it. When the storm broke, a dozen Hells Angels rolled into the diner's parking lot to retrieve their president. Dutch, leaning heavily on a makeshift cane, turned to Marianne and Arthur before throwing his leg over a patched-up bike. He handed her the black business card. "I don't do favors and I don't take charity," Dutch had said, his voice like gravel in a blender. "But my life, and my brothers' lives, are bound by respect. You ever need the devil on your side, Marianne, you call this number. Day or night. Heaven or hell." Now, sitting in the ruins of her life in 2008, Marianne pulled a flip phone from her pocket. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the sheer weight of what she was about to do. She dialed the number. It rang 4 times. Finally, a gruff, heavy voice answered. "Yeah, I'm looking for Dutch," Marianne said, her voice wavering. "This is Marianne Cobb, from the Copper Skillet in Pine Ridge." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The background noise of a busy bar suddenly went completely dead. "The pie lady," Dutch said softly. The years hadn't softened the grit in his voice. "Arthur pass on?" 3 years ago, Marianne said, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry to hear that. Why are you calling me, Marianne?" She took a deep breath. She told him everything. She told him about Mayor Briggs and the land developers. She told him about the harassment, the brick through the window, the sudden fines, And then, her voice breaking, she told him about the fire, the smell of gasoline, and Sheriff Dodd's refusal to investigate. "They offered me $25,000 for the ashes," she whispered. "They told me to leave town. Dutch, I don't have anywhere else to go." Another long silence stretched across the cellular network. When Dutch finally spoke, the casual warmth was gone. His voice was absolute ice. "Where are you right now?" "Sitting in my trailer behind the lot." "Lock the door. Make a pot of coffee. Don't talk to the police. And don't sign a damn thing." The line went dead. Friday night in Pine Ridge was usually quiet. But tonight, the atmosphere inside the Rusty Anchor, the local watering hole, was festive. Mayor Clayton Briggs sat in a corner booth, a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand, laughing loudly with Sheriff Dodd and Carter Dunn, the heavy-handed local contractor who had personally splashed the gasoline on Mary Ann's kitchen floor. "Paperwork goes through on Monday," Briggs sneered, clinking his glass against Dunn's beer bottle. "She's broke, she's beaten, and the bulldozer arrives Tuesday morning. Easiest real estate flip I've ever made." "You should have seen her face when I told her it was a grease fire," Dodd chuckled, wiping foam from his mustache. "I almost felt bad for her. Almost." It was 9:15 p.m. when the bartender stopped wiping down the counter and looked toward the front window. At first, it sounded like a low-pressure system rolling over the mountains, a deep, resonant vibration that rattled the liquor bottles on the glass shelves. But there were no clouds in the sky. The rumble grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards of the bar. It was a guttural, mechanical thunder. Sheriff Dodd frowned, setting his drink down. He stood up, walking toward the heavy wooden doors of the tavern, and pushed them open. The main street of Pine Ridge was a 2-lane road flanked by pine trees and street lamps, rolling slowly down the center of the asphalt. Bathed in the amber glow of the halogen lights was a column of motorcycles. Not a dozen, not 50, Dodd's breath caught in his throat. Stretching back as far as the eye could see, a massive, unyielding tidal wave of heavy American iron and black leather was flooding into the town. The thunder of hundreds of V-twin engines echoed off the storefronts, deafening and terrifying. At the head of the formation rode William Dutch Vanderhorn. He wasn't just flanked by his Oakland chapter. The call had gone out. Charters from California, Nevada, Washington, and Idaho had answered. 500 Hells Angels had just rolled into Pine Ridge. They didn't rev their engines aggressively. They didn't shout. They rode in a tight, disciplined formation, their faces hidden behind dark visors and bandanas, the winged death's heads on their cuts, stark against the night. The sheer, organized silence of the men contrasted violently with the deafening roar of their machines. They split at the intersection. 50 bikes peeled off to block the northern highway exit. 50 more blocked the southern bridge. The rest fanned out, circling the town square, parking their bikes in perfect diagonal rows that completely gridlocked the streets. Sheriff Dodd stumbled backward into the bar, his hand instinctively dropping to the handle of his service weapon. Mayor Briggs had stood up from his booth, the color completely draining from his face as he stared out the window. Pine Ridge was completely surrounded. Nobody was getting in, and nobody was getting out. The heavy oak doors of the Rusty Anchor didn't just open, they were violently shoved apart. William Dutch Vanderhorn stepped into the dimly lit tavern, bringing the cold night air and the overwhelming scent of exhaust and leather with him. Behind him, standing shoulder to shoulder, were 6 of his largest enforcers, including his sergeant-at-arms, a towering man named David Bones Miller, whose face was a map of old scars. The silence in the bar was absolute. The jukebox had been unplugged by a nervous patron minutes ago. Mayor Clayton Briggs froze in his booth, his glass of bourbon suspended halfway to his mouth, Contractor Carter Dunn looked like he was about to vomit. Sheriff Harlan Dodd, trying to project an authority he no longer possessed, rested his hand on his holstered sidearm and stepped forward. "Now you listen to me," Dodd barked, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know what kind of stunt you think you're pulling, but this is a quiet town. You boys are disturbing the peace, blocking public roads, and intimidating citizens. I want you on your bikes and out of Pine Ridge in 5 minutes, or I'm calling in the state troopers and starting a mass arrest." Dutch didn't blink. He casually reached into the inner pocket of his heavy leather cut. Dodd flinched, gripping his gun, but Dutch slowly withdrew a folded sheaf of papers and tossed it onto a nearby pool table. "You make that call, Sheriff," Dutch said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried to every corner of the room. "And while you're on the phone, read them that. That's a legally binding contract between the Hells Angels Motorcycle Corporation and Mary Ann Cobb. She just leased her entire property to us for an open-ended private event, and those bikes outside, legally parked. We paid the meters through Monday." Dutch took a slow, deliberate step toward Dodd, crowding the lawman's personal space. The sheer physical presence of the club president was suffocating. "We know our rights, Harlan," Dutch whispered, reading the name off the sheriff's badge. "We aren't breaking a single law, but we aren't leaving either. We are going to be a thorn in your side so deep you'll feel it in your jaw. We are going to patronize your businesses, walk your streets, and stand on Mary Ann's property until the truth about the copper skillet comes out." Dutch's dark eyes shifted past the trembling sheriff to lock on to Mayor Briggs and Carter Dunn. "I smell gasoline," Dutch said loudly, making sure every patron in the bar heard him. "And I don't think it came from a deep fryer." With that, Dutch turned on his heel and walked out, his men falling in line behind him like a military unit. The doors swung shut, leaving the corrupt town officials drowning in a sea of panic. By dawn the next morning, the smoldering ruins of the copper skillet had been transformed into a heavily fortified encampment. Dozens of RVs and supply trucks had rolled in before sunrise. The Hells Angels had set up industrial floodlights, portable generators, and a perimeter of chain-link fencing around Mary Ann's trailer. 500 patched members were camped out, and they operated with startling discipline. There was no public drinking, no fighting, and no noise violations. They simply existed, a massive, heavily tattooed army occupying the town. When Mayor Briggs tried to send his jittery health inspector to cite the encampment for sanitation violations, he was met by a wall of 30 bikers holding clipboards and a high-powered civil rights attorney from San Francisco named Jonathan Pierce, who handed the inspector a neatly typed list of federal statutes and a threat of a multi-million-dollar harassment lawsuit. The inspector literally ran back to his car. The psychological warfare was absolute. Every time Mayor Briggs left his house, a dozen Harleys would casually fall into formation behind his Cadillac, following him exactly at the speed limit. When Carter Dunn went to his construction yard, he found 100 bikers parked across the street, just standing by their machines, silently watching him. The town's economy, however, was booming. The Hells Angels bought out every diner, grocery store, and hardware shop in the county. The citizens of Pine Ridge, who had initially been terrified, quickly realized that the bikers were remarkably polite, tipped incredibly well, and directed all their menacing energy exclusively toward the mayor and his cronies. On Sunday morning, the pressure cracked the first weak link. Harrison Cole, the wealthy Seattle developer who had struck the backroom deal with Briggs, arrived in town to finalize the land transfer. When his chauffeured Mercedes navigated through streets lined with hundreds of glowering Hells Angels and arrived at the mayor's office, Cole took one look at the situation and lost his nerve. "I build truck stops, Clayton," Cole yelled inside the mayor's office, his voice carrying through the thin walls. "I don't build in war zones. You promised me a clean tie-title and a quiet widow. You didn't tell me I'd have the biggest outlaw motorcycle club on the planet, putting a target on my back." "Harrison, wait. We can handle them," Briggs pleaded, sweating profusely. "Dodd is working on an eviction notice." "Keep your land, Clayton. The deal is dead," Cole snapped, storming out of the office and ordering his driver to get him back to Seattle immediately. With the multi-million-dollar deal officially dead, Mayor Briggs was left with nothing but an angry town, a ruined reputation, and a very large, very angry motorcycle club camped on the edge of the highway. But Dutch Vanderhorn wasn't satisfied with just killing the land deal. He wanted justice for the widow who had saved his life, and he knew exactly how to get it. The twist in the tale didn't come from a courtroom, and it didn't come from a police investigation. It came from the sheer, unadulterated terror of a guilty conscience. Carter Dunn was a bully, but he was not a brave man. After 4 days of being silently stalked by Hell's Angels, finding winged death's head stickers on his truck windows, and receiving silent phone calls at 3 a.m., Dunn's nerve completely shattered. Late Tuesday night, Dunn packed a suitcase, threw it into the bed of his Chevy Silverado, and tried to skip town under the cover of darkness. He took the old logging roads, hoping to bypass the bikers guarding the highway bridges. 10 miles outside of Pine Ridge, a massive logging truck suddenly pulled across the narrow dirt road, blocking his path entirely. Dunn slammed on his brakes, kicking up a cloud of dust. Before he could throw the truck into reverse, a dozen headlights clicked on in the woods behind him. The deep, guttural roar of motorcycle engines surrounded him. He was boxed in. Dutch walked up to the driver's side window. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned against the door and looked at Dunn with eyes completely devoid of mercy. "Where are you going in such a hurry, Carter?" Dutch asked. "I don't know anything," Dunn whimpered, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. "I swear to God it was Briggs. He made me do it." Dutch pulled a small silver digital voice recorder from his pocket and pressed record. "Start from the beginning," Dutch commanded. For the next 20 minutes, Carter Dunn spilled everything. He confessed to throwing the brick through Mary Ann's window. He confessed to paying off the health inspector. And, most importantly, he confessed to splashing 3 gallons of unleaded gasoline in the kitchen of the copper skillet, while Sheriff Dodd sat in his cruiser at the end of the road, acting as a lookout. He even told Dutch where he had buried the melted gas can, behind his own tool shed. The Hells Angels didn't lay a single finger on Dunn. They didn't need to. They took the recorder, pulled the logging truck out of the way, and told Dunn to keep driving and never come back. The next morning, Dutch bypassed local law enforcement entirely. He handed the digital recorder and a detailed map of Dunn's property to State Attorney General Richard Hammond, a man well known for his hardline stance against municipal corruption. By noon on Thursday, the state police descended on Pine Ridge. It was a raid unlike anything the town had ever seen. Black SUVs surrounded the mayor's office and the sheriff's department simultaneously. Mayor Clayton Briggs was led out of City Hall in handcuffs, sobbing openly as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated his pale face. Sheriff Harlan Dodd was stripped of his badge and weapon, frog-marched out of his own precinct under the watchful eyes of 300 Hells Angels who had lined the sidewalk in total silence. As Dodd was pushed into the back of a state cruiser, Bones Miller gave him a slow, mocking salute. Justice had been served, but Mary Ann Cobb was still sitting in a trailer behind a pile of charred rubble. That was when the real work began. The Hells Angels didn't just pack up and leave. They traded their leather cuts for heavy canvas work jackets. They brought in excavators, dump trucks, and pallets of fresh lumber. For the next 3 weeks, the encampment transformed into a massive, organized construction site. Welders from the Oakland Charter framed a new steel skeleton. Electricians from the Seattle chapter ran state-of-the-art wiring. Carpenters from the Nevada crew built a sprawling new counter out of polished mahogany to replace the oak one Arthur had made. Marianne watched in awe from her porch as these massive, fearsome men worked 12-hour shifts in the sun, refusing to take a single dime in payment. When she tried to cook for them, they gently pushed her back into her chair and had their own prospects man the outdoor grills. "You did your time cooking, Marianne," Dutch told her one afternoon, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You just sit back and watch the show." Exactly 1 month after the fire, the barricades were moved. The debris was gone. Standing in its place was a brand-new, beautifully constructed diner. It was twice the size of the original, with gleaming stainless steel appliances, wide windows, and a fresh gravel parking lot. Above the door, a brand-new neon sign buzzed to life. It read, "The Copper Skillet." 2, directly underneath the sign, cast in solid iron and bolted permanently into the brickwork, was a subtle but unmistakable plaque. Protected by the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club by order of Dutch, the grand reopening was the biggest party Pine Ridge had ever seen. The entire town showed up, bringing pies, casseroles, and well-wishes. Marianne stood behind her new mahogany counter, tears streaming down her face as she poured coffee for the men who had given her life back to her. Dutch finished his slice of cherry pie, placed a crisp $100 bill on the counter, and refused his change. He leaned over the counter and kissed Marianne gently on the cheek. "Debt paid, Marianne," Dutch said softly. "You gave me a miracle, Dutch," she whispered, squeezing his massive, calloused hand. "No," Dutch smiled, pulling his dark sunglasses down over his eyes. "We just brought a little hell to the people who deserved it." The rumble of 500 motorcycles starting up at once shook the brand-new windows of the Copper Skillet. Marianne walked out onto the porch and watched as the massive column of iron and leather rolled out onto the highway, heading back into the mountains, leaving behind a town permanently changed and a widow who would never, ever be pushed around again. If this true story of outlaw justice, loyalty, and a widow fighting back against a corrupt system kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you the most intense, unbelievable real-life stories every single week. What do you think about Dutch and the Hells Angels stepping up when the law failed? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video with someone who loves a great comeback story. And hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. A split-second decision can cost you your life. When a lone waitress dragged a bleeding man into her diner's pantry, she thought she was saving a car crash victim. Then she saw the infamous Hells Angels death head on his leather vest. She had just become an accomplice to the deadliest outlaw motorcycle club in America. The Starlight Diner sat like a forgotten beacon on a desolate stretch of Interstate 40, just 20 miles outside of Barstow, California. It was the kind of place that catered to insomniacs, weary long-haul truckers, and people running from their pasts. Chloe Bennett belonged to the latter category. At 28, she had spent the last 2 years moving across state lines, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and an abusive ex-fiancé who had promised to put her in the ground. The graveyard shift at the Starlight offered her the anonymity she craved. Nobody asked questions at 3 in the morning. Outside, a rare Mojave desert thunderstorm was raging. Rain lashed against the large, grease-stained plate glass windows, and the diner's neon sign buzzed ominously, flickering a blood-red glow across the empty parking lot. Chloe stood behind the counter, a damp rag in hand, wiping down the formica surface for the 4th time that hour. The diner was completely empty. The cook, an older man named Hector, had called in sick, leaving Chloe entirely alone to manage the front and the grill. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the bell above the heavy glass door chimed violently. Chloe looked up, expecting a drenched trucker looking for black coffee. Instead, the door swung wide open, slamming against the adjacent wall with a sharp crack. A man stumbled over the threshold. He was massive, easily 6'4" and pushing 250 pounds. He didn't walk, he swayed, leaning heavily against the nearest booth. "Hey, mister, we're open." But Chloe's voice trailed off as a jagged flash of lightning illuminated the diner. The man was clutching his side. Dark, thick liquid seeped between his large fingers, dripping onto the pristine checkerboard linoleum floor. He took another agonizing step toward the counter, his boots squeaking wetly against the tiles before his knees buckled. He collapsed face first, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Panic seized Chloe's chest. Her first instinct was to grab the phone receiver and dial 911. Her hand hovered over the rotary dial, but the man on the floor groaned, shifting his weight. "No cops!" he gasped, his voice a gravelly rasp that barely carried over the sound of the thunder. "Please, no cops. They'll finish it." Chloe froze. The desperation in his voice triggered a deep, buried memory of her own, of begging a neighbor not to call the police because she knew her ex would only get angrier. Against her better judgment, she dropped the phone and rushed around the counter, sliding to her knees beside the giant of a man. As she rolled him onto his back, she got her first real look at him. He had a thick, rain-matted beard peppered with grey, a bruised jaw, and a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow. But it wasn't his face that made Chloe's blood run cold. It was what he was wearing. Stitched onto the back of his heavy, soaked leather vest was the winged skull wearing a motorcycle helmet, the world-renowned Death Head. Above it, in bold red letters outlined in white, read the words, "Hell's Angels." Below the skull, the bottom rocker proudly proclaimed California. Chloe stopped breathing. She knew enough about biker culture to know that you didn't mess with the Hell's Angels, and you certainly didn't involve yourself in their wars. On the front of his cut, a small rectangular patch over his heart read President. Another read Thomas Brick Wallace. "Mr. Wallace," Chloe whispered, her hands shaking as she pressed the dirty bar rag against the bullet hole in his side. "You're bleeding out. I have to call an ambulance. If you call them, I'm dead. And you're dead too," Brick wheezed, his eyes rolling back in his head. Suddenly, the blinding high beams of a vehicle swept across the front windows of the diner, illuminating the pouring rain outside. The headlights cut through the darkness, pulling into the far end of the parking lot. 2 deep, rumbling engines roared over the storm. Motorcycles. Someone had followed him. Chloe's survival instincts kicked into overdrive. She couldn't leave him on the floor, and she couldn't let whoever was out there find him. Adrenaline surged through her slender frame. She grabbed Brick by the thick leather collar of his sacred cut, digging her heels into the linoleum. "Come on, you have to help me," she hissed, straining every muscle in her body. Brick gritted his teeth, finding a reserve of agonizing strength. Using his good arm, he pushed off the floor, allowing Chloe to drag him backward. His heavy boots left a thick, smeared trail of crimson across the tiles. They stumbled behind the counter, knocking over a stack of plastic menus, and staggered towards the back of the diner. Chloe shoved open the heavy wooden door to the dry storage pantry. The room was pitch black, smelling strongly of raw flour, canned peaches, and old cardboard. She dragged Brick into the darkest corner, behind a towering stack of 50-pound potato sacks. He slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow and ragged. "Don't make a sound," Chloe whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She sprinted back out into the main diner. The headlights outside had cut off. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel outside the front door. Chloe stared in horror at the massive smear of blood leading from the entrance to the counter. Grabbing a mop and a bucket of heavy-duty industrial bleach left by the sink, she sloshed the chemical across the floor. To mask the color of the remaining blood, she grabbed a glass bottle of cherry pie syrup from the shelf and smashed it directly onto the floor where Brick had fallen. The thick, dark red syrup exploded outward, mixing with the bleach and the blood. She was on her hands and knees, frantically scrubbing the floor with a towel, when the bell above the door chimed a second time. 2 men stepped into the Starlight Diner, bringing the cold dampness of the storm in with them. Chloe kept her head down, scrubbing furiously at the sticky mess of cherry syrup, bleach, and Thomas Wallace's blood, praying the pungent smell of the chemicals would mask the metallic scent of copper hanging in the air. "Diner's closed," Chloe called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Health inspector's coming tomorrow, doing a deep clean." "Neon sign says open, darlin'," a deep, amused voice replied. Chloe slowly stood up, wiping her stained hands on her apron. The man who had spoken was imposing. He wore a heavy leather jacket over a black hoodie, but the jacket was unzipped just enough for Chloe to catch a glimpse of the winged skull patch on his chest. His name patch read Gage. He had cold, dead eyes and a snake tattoo winding its way up his neck. Beside Gage stood a man who made Chloe's stomach drop. He wasn't a biker. He was wearing the tan uniform of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. His name tag read Deputy Clint Evans. "Sorry about the mess, officers. Gentlemen," Chloe corrected herself, gripping the handle of the mop to hide her trembling hands. "I dropped a whole gallon of cherry syrup. What can I do for you?" Deputy Evans stepped forward, resting his hand casually on the butt of his service weapon. "You're working out here all alone, miss?" "Just me," Chloe lied smoothly. "Cook went home early." Gage stepped past the deputy, his heavy boots walking directly over the spot where Brick had collapsed minutes earlier. He stopped at the counter, leaning over it, his eyes scanning the open kitchen, the fryers, and the hallway leading to the restrooms and storage. "We're looking for a friend of ours," Gage said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Big guy. Beard. Probably wearing a leather vest just like mine. You seen anyone matching that description blow through here in the last 20 minutes? Chloe met Gage's dead eyes. She thought of her ex, of the men who thought they could intimidate her through sheer size and cruelty. A cold, defensive rage settled over her fear. "I told you I've been deep cleaning for an hour. Nobody's been in here since a trucker bought a slice of pie at 1:30. She gestured to the smashed glass and red puddle. "And then I broke this, and I've been scrubbing ever since. If your friend came by, I didn't see him." Deputy Evans walked over to the smear on the floor. He squatted down, squinting at the red liquid. Chloe held her breath. If he touched it, if he realized the consistency was too thin to just be syrup, she was dead. "Smells like a damn swimming pool in here with all this bleach," Evans muttered, wrinkling his nose and standing back up. "Like I said, deep cleaning," Chloe fired back. Gage stared at Chloe for a long, agonizing moment. He was hunting for a crack in her armor, a twitch in her eye, a drop of sweat on her brow. Chloe forced herself to look incredibly annoyed, the perfect picture of an underpaid waitress irritated by an interruption. "All right," Gage finally said, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's ride, Clint." Maybe he pushed on toward Vegas. "You girls be careful out here," Deputy Evans offered. A hollow, mocking tone in his voice. They turned and walked out into the storm. Chloe watched through the front windows as they mounted their bikes and roared out of the parking lot, their tail lights fading into the heavy rain. She waited 3 full minutes, staring out into the dark, ensuring they weren't waiting in the shadows. When she was absolutely sure they were gone, she locked the deadbolt on the front door, switched off the open sign, and ran to the back pantry. She shoved the heavy wooden door open, clicking on the single overhead bulb. Brick was right where she left him, but as the light flickered on, Chloe froze. In his right hand, completely steady despite his blood loss, Brick held a massive .45 caliber 1911 pistol. The barrel was pointed directly at Chloe's chest. "Shut the door!" Brick rasped. Chloe carefully closed the door behind her, raising her hands. "I just saved your life. I lied to the cops for you." "That wasn't a cop," Brick growled, lowering the gun slightly but not holstering it. "That was Clint Evans. He's on Gage's payroll. If you had blinked wrong, they would have put a bullet in your head and burned this diner to the foundation." "Who is Gage?" Chloe asked, dropping to her knees to inspect the makeshift bandage she had applied earlier. It was soaked through. "He's my vice president," Brick said, a bitter, painful laugh escaping his lips. "Or he was, until about an hour ago, when he put a hollow point in my ribs." Chloe moved his heavy leather vest aside, carefully peeling back his blood-soaked flannel shirt. The bullet had passed clean through his side, a blessing, as it meant she didn't have to dig the lead out. "Why is your own club trying to kill you?" Chloe asked, grabbing a first aid kit she kept on a shelf nearby. She poured rubbing alcohol over a thick gauze pad. "This is going to burn like hell." Brick didn't even flinch as she pressed the burning alcohol into his open wound. He stared at the ceiling, his jaw locked. "The Hells Angels are outlaws," Brick said softly, his voice echoing in the small pantry. "We sell guns, we move product, we break jaws. I won't lie to you about what I am, but we have a code. There are lines we don't cross. Gage crossed it." Brick reached into the inner pocket of his sacred leather vest. His fingers returned trembling, holding a small, blood-smeared black ledger. "The San Luis cartel approached us 3 months ago," Brick continued, his breath hitching as Chloe taped the gauze tight. "They wanted to use our trucking routes to move fentanyl into California. I voted it down at the table. Too much heat, too dirty. Kills kids. But Gage saw the money. He bypassed me. He's been using the club's resources behind my back, dealing with the cartel, paying off dirty badges like Evans to look the other way." Chloe stared at the ledger in his hands. "What is that?" "Names," Brick said, looking directly into Chloe's eyes. "Drop locations, bank accounts. It's the whole operation. I found it tonight at the clubhouse. I confronted Gage. I told him I was going to bring it to the other charters, call a vote to strip his patch and excommunicate him. But he had half my men bought off. It was an ambush." Brick grabbed Chloe's wrist, his grip shockingly strong. "That book proves Gage is a rat, selling out the club to a Mexican cartel. If I can get it to the national president in Oakland, Gage is a dead man walking, and the club is clean." Chloe felt a chill run down her spine. "And if Gage gets it back, then he takes over the Nevada and Southern California charters. The cartel moves thousands of kilos of fentanyl through our state without opposition, and I get buried in an unmarked grave." Brick coughed, a speck of blood appearing on his lips. "You shouldn't have hidden me, kid. You're in the game now. Gage isn't stupid. He'll realize my bike wasn't on the highway. He'll come back to this diner. And next time, he won't bother asking questions." The harsh reality of Brick's words hung in the suffocating air of the pantry. Chloe looked at the massive biker, his skin pale and clammy beneath the harsh glare of the single overhead bulb. He was right. Gage was a predator, and predators didn't just walk away when the scent went cold. They doubled back. "We can't stay here," Chloe said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "My car is parked out back behind the dumpsters. It's a beat-up Ford Taurus, but it runs. If I can get you to the passenger side, we can take the dirt access roads. They won't see us on the interstate." "You're not thinking clearly, kid," Brick grunted, adjusting his grip on the .45 pistol. "Gage has Evans. That means he has police radios. He's got state troopers and county deputies looking the other way or actively hunting me down. The second we hit the road, we're sitting ducks." Before Chloe could argue, a sound cut through the relentless drumming of the rain on the tin roof. It was a low, guttural vibration that rattled the canned goods on the shelves. It wasn't just two motorcycles this time. It was a pack. Chloe crept out of the pantry, keeping low behind the front counter, and peeked over the edge of the pie display case. Outside, 5 motorcycles were tearing into the Starlight's parking lot, their headlights cutting violently through the storm. Gage and Deputy Evans had returned, bringing reinforcements. 3 massive men dismounted, wielding heavy steel crowbars and sawed-off shotguns. Gage walked directly to the front door and tested the handle. Finding the deadbolt locked, he didn't even hesitate. He raised a booted foot and kicked the heavy plate glass door. The glass shattered with an explosive crash, raining jagged shards across the linoleum floor. "I know you're in there, Brick," Gage's voice bellowed, echoing off the diner's aluminum paneling. "Found your pan head stashed behind the billboard a mile down the road. You didn't walk far bleeding like a stuck pig." Chloe scrambled back to the pantry on her hands and knees. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. For 2 years, she had run. She had changed her name, her hair color, and her life to hide from a man who wanted to hurt her. Now, she was trapped in a box with a dying outlaw, and 5 heavily armed killers outside. "They're inside," Chloe gasped, sliding the heavy pantry door shut and locking the flimsy deadbolt. Brick didn't look afraid. A cold, terrifying calm washed over his weathered face. He reached out with his bloody left hand and shoved the black ledger into Chloe's apron pocket. "Listen to me," Brick whispered, his eyes locking onto hers. "When they breach this room, I'm going to empty this clip. You stay low. You crawl out the back loading dock, and you run to your car. You drive north to Oakland. You ask for a man named Jackson Bear Halloway. You give him that book, and you tell him Brick sent you." "I am not leaving you here to die," Chloe shot back, her voice shaking, but laced with a sudden, fierce defiance. She had spent too much of her life feeling helpless. She was done running. Chloe stood up, reached behind the top shelf of the pantry, and pulled down a long canvas bag. Hector, the paranoid night cook, had always told her he kept a little insurance in the back, just in case the register ever got held up. She unzipped the bag, revealing a sleek, pump-action Mossberg 500 shotgun and a bandolier of heavy buckshot shells. Brick raised an eyebrow, genuinely impressed. "You know how to use that thing, waitress?" "My daddy was a hunter in Montana," Chloe said, chambering around with a loud, satisfying clack that echoed in the small space. "I know how to shoot." Outside the pantry, Heavy boots stomped through the kitchen. Pots and pans crashed to the floor as Gage's men tore the place apart. "Check the back rooms," Gage yelled, "and find that lying little waitress. I want her tongue cut out for making me look stupid." Footsteps approached the pantry door. The doorknob rattled aggressively. "Locked!" a gruff voice called out. "Shoot the hinges, Colton," Gage ordered from the hallway. Chloe didn't wait. She leveled the Mossberg at the center of the wooden door and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. A massive hole exploded through the wood, followed by a scream of pure agony from the other side. Colton collapsed, his shotgun clattering against the tile floor. "They're in the pantry," another biker roared. "Give 'em hell, kid," Brick grinned, pushing himself up to a kneeling position, bracing his heavy pistol against a sack of flour. The diner erupted into chaos. A hail of bullets tore through the pantry door, shredding the wood into splinters. Cans of tomatoes and peaches exploded, raining sticky syrup and red paste over Chloe and Brick. Chloe pressed her back against the cinder block wall, pumping another shell into the chamber. "Evans, get a tear gas canister from your cruiser!" Gage screamed over the gunfire. "I'm not dying for your cartel payout, Gage," Deputy Evans yelled back, his voice trembling with panic. "This wasn't part of the deal." "You're in it now, Badge." Brick caught Chloe's eye and nodded toward the loading dock door at the back of the pantry. It was their only exit. "Cover me!" Brick yelled. Chloe swung out from behind the shelving unit, blindly firing the shotgun through the shredded door. The booming spread of the buckshot forced the bikers in the hallway to dive for cover. Taking advantage of the suppressive fire, Brick threw his massive weight against the heavy metal loading dock door, bursting out into the freezing rain of the alleyway. Chloe followed a split second later, the cold air biting at her lungs. They scrambled behind the rusting metal of the commercial dumpsters, just as Gage and a biker named Jace burst through the pantry, firing wildly into the alley. "Flank them!" Gage commanded. Jace vaulted off the loading dock, splashing into the muddy puddles, an assault rifle raised to his shoulder. Brick leaned around the edge of the dumpster, his hand steady despite the blood pooling around his boots. He fired twice. The massive .45 caliber slugs hit Jace squarely in the chest, dropping the biker backward into the mud. Suddenly, a spotlight clicked on from the end of the alley. Deputy Evans had pulled his cruiser around back, blinding Chloe and Brick. Over the cruiser's PA system, Evans' voice boomed. "Drop the weapons! Throw the ledger out, Brick, and maybe Gage lets the girl live." Brick slumped against the dumpster, his strength finally failing him. His gun clicked empty. He fumbled for a spare magazine, his fingers slipping on his own blood. "I'm out," he rasped, looking at Chloe. "Take the car. Go." Chloe looked from Brick to the blinding spotlight of the cruiser, to the shadowy silhouette of Gage creeping down the loading dock stairs. If she ran, Brick died. If she ran, the cartel won. And if she ran, she would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. She gripped the Mossberg, feeling the heavy rain slicking her hair to her face. She took a deep breath, stepping out from behind the safety of the dumpster. "Put it down, little girl," Deputy Evans yelled from behind the open door of his cruiser. Chloe didn't aim at the deputy. She aimed at the cruiser's flashing light bar. She pulled the trigger. The buckshot shattered the spotlight and the red and blue strobes, plunging the alley into darkness. Evans shrieked, ducking for cover. In the sudden pitch black, Gage lost his bearings. He fired wildly in Chloe's direction, the muzzle flash illuminating his position. That was the mistake. Brick, summoning the absolute last ounce of his strength, lunged forward from the darkness. He tackled Gage, driving the much younger man into the brick wall of the diner. The two massive outlaws grappled in the mud, fighting for control of Gage's weapon. "You sold us out!" Brick roared, delivering a crushing headbutt to Gage's face. Gage grunted, slamming his knee into Brick's bullet wound. Brick gasped in agony, his grip faltering. Gage raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Brick's head. A deafening blast echoed through the alley. Gage froze. He looked down at his chest, a look of absolute shock twisting his features. He crumpled to the ground, dead before he hit the mud. Chloe stood 10 feet away, the smoking barrel of the Mossberg lowered. She racked the pump, ejecting the spent shell, and leveled the gun at the police cruiser. "Evans!" Chloe screamed, her voice cutting through the storm like a blade. "Start the car and drive away, or I put the next one through your engine block." Tires screeched as the corrupt deputy threw the cruiser into reverse, tearing out of the parking lot and abandoning his dead partners in the mud. Silence fell over the Starlight Diner, broken only by the steady drum of the rain. Chloe dropped the shotgun, her knees finally giving out. She crawled through the mud to Brick. The giant biker was bleeding heavily, but he was breathing. He looked up at her, a weak, blood-stained smile crossing his lips. "Remind me, never to tip you under 20%, Brick whispered before passing out. 2 days later, in a heavily fortified hospital room in Oakland, California, Thomas Brick Wallace opened his eyes. Sitting in the chair beside his bed was Jackson Bear Halloway, the national president of the Hells Angels. "You made it, brother," Jackson said, his voice like grinding stones. "The ledger?" Brick asked weakly. "Delivered," Jackson nodded. "Gage's men are being handled. The cartel connection is severed. You saved the club, Brick." "Wasn't me," Brick said, looking toward the door. Standing in the doorway, wearing a clean leather jacket, was Chloe. She wasn't holding a coffee pot or a waitress tray. She looked tougher, grounded, completely devoid of the fear that had once defined her. "She brought it to me," Jackson said, standing up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy gold ring bearing the death head insignia. He walked over to Chloe and pressed it into her palm. "From this day forward, nobody touches you. Nobody looks at you wrong. If that ex-fiancé of yours ever comes looking, you make one phone call and 80 brothers will show up on his lawn. You're under the protection of the Hells Angels." Chloe looked at the ring, then at Brick. She had spent years running from monsters. She never expected that her salvation would come from hiding one. If this pulse-pounding, true story of survival, betrayal, and outlaw justice kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to smash that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the wildest hidden stories of the underworld. Share this video with your friends and let us know in the comments below. Would you have risked it all to save a stranger? See you in the next one.
It was just a battered piece of photographic paper, faded at the edges and creased down the middle. To the street thugs who stole it, it was garbage. To 72-year-old Arthur Higgins, it was his breathing heart, the very last picture of his late wife. Within hours, the Hells Angels made those thieves wish they had never been born. The rain was coming down in thick gray sheets over Oakland, California, hammering against the corrugated tin roof of Arthur Higgins' detached garage. It was a Tuesday night in late November, the kind of night that soaked right through to the bone. At 72, Arthur's bones already ached enough. He sat in his worn recliner, nursing a mug of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring blankly at the muted television. Arthur was a man carved from a different era. His forearms, though thinning with age, were still wrapped in the faded blue-green ink of tattoos he'd gotten in the late 1970s. For 30 years he had been a heavy diesel mechanic, wrenching on big rigs until his arthritis forced him to hand over his tools. But his real passion, his lifeblood, sat out in that cold garage, a pristine, custom-built 1948 Harley-Davidson Panhead. He had rebuilt every inch of that motorcycle with his own 2 hands. Yet the bike's true value had nothing to do with chrome or horsepower. Tucked deep inside the heavy leather of the left saddlebag, wrapped meticulously in a piece of oiled canvas and slid into a waterproof ziplock, was a Polaroid photograph. It was taken in the summer of 1998 at the lip of the Grand Canyon. In the photo, his wife Martha was leaning back against the sissy bar of the panhead, her wild blonde hair whipped across her smiling face, laughing at something Arthur had just said off camera. 3 years ago, pancreatic cancer had taken Martha in a matter of brutal, agonizing months. In the chaos of hospital bills, moving to a smaller house, and the blinding fog of grief, a basement flood had destroyed the boxes containing their family photo albums. That single heavily protected Polaroid in the saddlebag was the only surviving photograph Arthur had of the woman he had loved for 4 decades. At 1:14 a.m., a sharp, unnatural crack echoed through the drumming rain. Arthur bolted upright. The sound hadn't come from the street. It came from the backyard, from the garage. Ignoring the sharp pain in his knees, Arthur grabbed the heavy steel maglite flashlight he kept by the door and stepped out into the freezing downpour. He didn't bother with a coat. He crossed the muddy grass, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. As he rounded the corner of the house, the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness and illuminated a nightmare. The heavy wooden double doors of his garage were splintered. The solid steel padlock lay in the mud, sheared clean in half by industrial bolt cutters. "No," Arthur rasped, his voice barely audible over the rain. "No, no, no." He rushed inside, flicking the light switch. The bare bulb buzzed to life, casting harsh shadows across the empty concrete floor. The drip pans were there. His toolbox was there. But the center of the room was empty. The panhead was gone. Arthur dropped the flashlight. It clattered against the concrete, the beam spinning wildly before settling on a puddle of muddy water mixed with fresh oil drops leading out to the alley. He fell to his knees, his hands trembling violently. He didn't care about the thousands of dollars worth of vintage motorcycle parts. He didn't care about the engine he had meticulously tuned. Martha. He choked out, the tears finally mixing with the rain dripping from his face. They took her. It took 20 minutes for the Oakland Police Department to arrive. 2 young patrolmen, Officer Miller and Officer Jenkins, stepped out of their cruiser, their uniforms shielded by bright yellow raincoats. They walked the perimeter, shining their flashlights into the alleyway, looking thoroughly unimpressed by the tragedy that had just destroyed Arthur's world. "Looks like a professional snatch and grab, Mr. Higgins," Officer Miller said, clicking his pen and scribbling on a soaked notepad. Vintage Harleys are highly targeted. They likely backed a box truck right up to the alley, rolled it in, and were gone in 60 seconds. "You have to find it," Arthur pleaded, gripping the officer's sleeve. "I don't care about the insurance money. There's a picture in the saddlebag. It's the last picture of my wife. She passed away. It's all I have left." "But," Officer Jenkins offered a sympathetic but entirely hollow sigh. "We'll put out a bolo bee on the lookout for the bike, sir. But I have to be honest with you, these rings work fast. By tomorrow morning, that bike will either be in a shipping container bound for overseas, or it'll be stripped down to the frame and sold for parts. Any personal items in the bags are usually tossed in a dumpster." Arthur stared at them, a cold, dark realization settling over him. The police were treating this like a statistic. To them it was just another property theft in a city plagued by property theft. They would file the paperwork, hand it off to a detective who already had 100 open cases, and the panhead and Martha's smile would vanish into the criminal underworld forever. He watched the cruiser pull away, its red and blue lights fading into the foggy night. Arthur walked back into his house dripping wet, shivering and entirely alone. He walked into his bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of his dresser. He pushed aside a stack of old flannels and pulled out a small, dusty wooden cigar box. Inside was a small, leather-bound address book, its pages yellowed and brittle. Arthur hadn't opened this book in over 10 years. He had walked away from the rougher edges of his